Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 37 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Each week, we sit down with an historian to discuss their unique insights into our early American past so we can learn more about who we are and how we can affect a better future. Trivia time. What battle proved to be the turning point of the War for American Independence? If you answered Saratoga, you are in general agreement with most scholars of the American Revolution. General John Burgoyne's surrender to Horatio Gates and the Continental Army on October 17, 1777, demonstrated to France that the Americans had what it took to defeat the British Army. The Patriot victory at Saratoga stands among the top reasons why France entered the war on behalf of the United States. And with France came Spain. Spain and France had a treaty agreement whereby if one nation went to war, the other must follow. And this is how France and Spain came to be involved in the American War for Independence. Today we kick off our Happy Birthday, United States series with 5 episodes that will allow us to explore the American Revolution and its War for Independence from different vantage points. And today's guest offers us a very different vantage point from which to view the American Revolution and its War for Independence. Today, Kathleen DuVal, a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and author of Independence Lost: Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution, takes us on a journey to the Gulf Coast so we can explore how the American Revolution and its war took place in this region. Now, if you're sitting there scratching your head at the moment and mentally saying, I didn't know the American Revolution took place in the Gulf Coast, it's okay. I had the same reaction. And I think most of our fellow Americans who live outside the Gulf Coast have the same reaction. But the truth is, the American Revolution and its war did reach the Gulf Coast, and several battles were fought there, including the Battle of Pensacola in 1781. During our exploration of the Gulf Coast, Kathleen reveals information about the region, its geography, the European powers involved in the region, and the cultural diversity of the people who live there. Details about the Battle of Pensacola, including the strategies employed by the British General John Campbell and Spanish General Bernardo de Galvez, and how and why the Battle of Pensacola stands as another important turning point in the War for American Independence, and what it meant for the war and the people who lived through it. I really enjoyed reading Kathleen's book, Independence Lost, and I think you will find our conversation fascinating. So let's get to it.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Kathleen DuVal is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is fascinated by American borderland regions and the cross-cultural interactions that took place there between the 16th and 19th centuries. Kathleen is also the author of 2 books, including Native Ground: Indians and Colonists in the Heart of the Continent, and, most recently, Independence Lost: Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Kathleen.
Well, thank you very much, Liz. I'm delighted to be here.
And we're really delighted to have you here today because your new book, Independence Lost, offers us a very different view of the American Revolution because it traces the course of the revolution along the Gulf Coast, not the traditional Atlantic seaboard, but the Gulf Coast. Would you tell us what attracted you to the study of the American Revolution in the Gulf Coast region? And perhaps you could provide us with a refresher on what we mean by the Gulf Coast region.
Oh, sure, absolutely. This actually started in a talk I gave to the Society of Cincinnati in Philadelphia. And that's an organization of descendants of officers during the Revolution. They know a ton about the American Revolution. And I thought, what on earth can I tell them that they don't already know about the American Revolution? But my first book was about Spanish and French colonization in the Mississippi Valley. And I knew from that research, from that work, that Spain had been involved in the American Revolution and, in fact, had fought battles on the Gulf Coast at Mobile and Pensacola and Baton Rouge. And so I gave a talk to the Society of Cincinnati about the Spanish and the American Revolution. And one of the great things about the Society of Cincinnati is they have their drinks before the talk instead of after. And so their enthusiastic reaction to my talk may have come in part by the fact that they had had a few drinks. But they said they loved it. They laughed at all my jokes. They enjoyed the talk. And I thought, if they don't know about this part of the revolution, maybe nobody else does. And not even most historians of the American Revolution know about Spain's role in the revolution and what happened on the Gulf Coast. But yet I think it's a really important part of the overall war. In some ways, some of the most diverse interests were there. So on the Gulf Coast, Britain was fighting not against its own colonists, but against the Spanish, who were trying to take advantage of the rebellion to seize some British colonies for themselves, the Spanish Empire. But it was also a place that brought in lots of other kind of people, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creeks, and lots of other people. I'm sure I'll talk with you later about in the interview. And just to answer the second part of your question, the Gulf Coast, for the purposes of the book, is the place where these battles took place, basically stretching from New Orleans to Pensacola. So what's now the state of Louisiana, east through southern Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. But that's just where the focus of the action is, and then it brings in people from the interior, mostly native peoples from the interior, and then people and resources and attention from the Caribbean and Europe and beyond.
Well, I consider myself an American Revolution aficionado, and I didn't know that there were any battles in the Gulf Coast. So I think your assessment was right, and that's probably why I enjoyed reading your book so much.
Right.
Before we dive into the American Revolution in the region, let's take a step back and look at the French and Indian War, which took place between 1754 and 1763. That war reshaped the borders of the globe. Kathleen, would you help us understand how the war impacted and changed the Gulf Coast? Perhaps you could tell us what the political landscape looked like. Which European powers governed the area before the war, and which powers remained after the war?
Right. That's a great question. So for Europeans, French and Indian War changed the geography of the Mississippi Valley tremendously. When we learn about the Louisiana Purchase, we see that what looks like a huge map of Louisiana. But French Louisiana, before the French and Indian War, was actually double that size because French Louisiana was on both sides of the Mississippi. So the French colony of Louisiana was Louisiana and Arkansas and Missouri, all that in the west, but then also the eastern Mississippi Valley, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Indiana, all that region, those states today. And so with the British victory in the 7 Years' War, France gave up that entire colony, that huge colony, and it got divided in half. So the western half ended up still being called Louisiana, and it went to Spain, which is another part of American history that I think people forget or never learn, that the colony of Louisiana in the west became Spanish. And then also at the end of the 7 Years' War, the eastern half of what had been French colonial Louisiana went to the British, and they called it West Florida. So that was the eastern half of French Louisiana. Now, on the ground, there were many, many more Indians than there were colonists of any kind, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and lots of smaller tribes as well. And so basically Europeans had come in and sort of put their own sovereignty on top of really Indian power on the ground. So on the ground, not that much changed because of the French and Indian War, but as far as what Europeans claimed the regions, that changed a lot.
You mentioned West Florida. Was there an East Florida, and did Great Britain rule that as well, or was it just called West Florida?
No, that's right. That's great. So basically, more or less what we consider the state of Florida today, although with some of the panhandle locked off, so a little smaller than what the state of Florida is today. That was East Florida. That had actually been Spanish before the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. And that did get transferred to Britain at the end of the French and Indian War. So in sort of extremely complicated negotiations that ended that war. And so Britain had West Florida and East Florida between the time of the French and Indian War and the Revolution.
So the large Louisiana territory had been French. After the French and Indian War, it gets divided between Great Britain and Spain. Now that we understand what political powers are there, What kind of peoples live there? You have the French, the Spanish, the British. Are they all living there peaceably? And there's Native American peoples too, right?
Right. So I can sort of walk you through it. There are colonial settlements, New Orleans, Mobile, Pensacola, a few more posts up the Mississippi River, Natchez, up through St. Louis. And at those posts, most of the people are actually still French. They're either leftover French settlers from French Louisiana who didn't leave. And then some of them are Acadians who come over the course of the French and Indian War for refuge in the Catholic colony in Louisiana. Now, some of those places, the ones that end up in West Florida or East Florida, they do start to attract British settlement because they have land available. It is, in fact, one of the things that the Proclamation of 1763 says, which is supposed to keep British settlers off of Indian lands west of the Appalachians. It invites them into West and East Florida because there is some land there available to them. So you've got these colonial settlements with British and French people, very, very few Spaniards, except for soldiers. And then after the French and Indian War, both the British and the Spanish began to import large numbers of slaves into these colonies. The French had actually shut off the slave trade after the Natchez War and had halted the growth of plantations, but that starts to grow again. So the African population of the region is growing in the period between the French and Indian War and the Revolution. But then I think if you sort of think about this geography, these are little spots on the ground of colonial posts and plantations. And I estimate that Europeans probably control fewer than 100 square miles of the colonies of Louisiana and West Florida, whereas American Indians controlled probably 300,000 square miles. The Creek Confederacy had about 10,000 people in what's now Georgia and Alabama, probably 20,000 Choctaws in Alabama and Mississippi, and about 5,000 Chickasaws living in what's now northern Mississippi and Tennessee. And then lots and lots of smaller nations, usually under the protection of one of these larger nations.
This is a really diverse region, and there doesn't appear to be any one imperial or political powerhouse in the region. It just seems like power and peoples are dispersed.
That's right. That's exactly right. So, if you had to pick one, the most powerful people, you might see the Choctaws, you might see the Creeks, but because American Indians were, as you know, in different sovereignties and often were fighting each other in this region in this period, what you say is exactly right. It's not clear who's in charge, and it's really split up into smaller places of where people have power and where they need to get along with their neighbors or they're fighting with their neighbors.
Is it because there are so many peoples living in that region and the power is so diverse that's why the British part of that region did not rebel with the other 13 colonies when they start to protest taxation and parliamentary involvement in their governments?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's a very different kind of population from what you find in most of the 13 colonies. When we think of there being 13 British colonies at the time of the Revolution, but there were probably more. They're more like 26, or probably double that number in the 1760s and 70s, depending on how exactly you count the various West Indies islands. So all of these places had protests against the Stamp Act. There was a huge protest against the Stamp Act in Pensacola, but about half of these British colonies, as you say, chose not to join this rebellion, especially the independence movement, and as it becomes an independence movement. And I think it's because, yeah, you're right, it's because of this kind of population, this complicated population where Europeans really don't hold that much power. And I think they feared independence, being left alone. They feared that more than taxes or the other strictures of empire. So the colonies that didn't rebel, including West Florida, tended to be places with, as we say, smaller white populations, smaller populations of Europeans, near larger populations of Indians, and often large populations of slaves as well. And they really valued the things that the British Empire provided: protection from non-Europeans, and the market, and the availability of products, the availability to buy slaves, the things they could do that they felt that empire provided them. And it actually took a lot of persuasion out of New England to get the southern colonies even to join, the ones that did join, and places like West Florida, geographically farther from the rebellion, but also in places that the rebellion just seemed less safe, more dangerous. They tended to stick with the empire.
Let's begin exploring how the American War for Independence unfolded in the Gulf Coast. Both Spain and Great Britain are in the region, and they're both trying to expand their armies to protect their holdings. by cultivating favor with Native American peoples. Would you tell us how the British and Spanish went about trying to secure the services of Native American warriors, and what side, if any, those Native American peoples took?
So the British and the Spanish approached that task with very different assumptions. The British actually thought all of these native peoples would be on their side. They understood correctly that the Chickasaws and the Choctaws and the Creeks felt that it was British settlers, the Americans, who were the greatest threat to them. They were the ones who were trying to expand onto their land, the British Empire, in trying to pull them into the war, promised them that they would continue to protect their lands from the settlers. So the British thought that it would be pretty easy to get Indians to fight on their side. The Spanish haven't been involved with these Indians for as long, and they know it's going to be harder sell. So they actually put a lot of money and time into the diplomacy of just trying to convince these various Indian groups to stay out of the war, just not to fight at all. So this created a pretty big debate among these Indian people. Of course, they had their own foreign policies. They made their own decisions about war. They didn't just do things that Europeans told them to do. And they did oppose settlers. That was probably their number one goal as vis-a-vis Europeans, besides trade. But some Indians said, let's just let them fight it out. let the British and their settlers fight, the Spanish, whoever joins this war, and we'll just sort of be still standing when it's all over. So those Indians in the Southeast who often did fight on the side of the British, usually in raids against settlers, particularly settlements that they felt had ventured onto their land. But they ran against a real problem allying with the British, because the British, as you know, were really worried about the future of these colonies, and if they could bring the colonies back into the empire, then they would need to resolve some of these differences. These were their own subjects that were leading this independence movement, and if they came back into the empire, they would need to get along with them again. And they were definitely not on the same page as Indians who simply wanted to attack settlements, drive them back, didn't really care if people called themselves loyalists or not loyalists. If they were on Creek land, they were a Creek enemy to them. So that created real problems between the British and their Indian allies. And at the same time, the Spanish were just spending the presents and saying, just stay home, everything will be fine, we support your land rights. So by the time of the battles on the Gulf Coast, most Indians actually did stay home, and the British had tremendously fewer allies helping them in these battles, Indian allies helping them in these battles than they had hoped. And they didn't have that many soldiers stationed there anyway. And so it's possible that if more Indians had come to fight on the side of the British, it's quite likely they would have prevailed in these battles. So it was quite important for how these battles went, and also for some of the battles in the South, the rest of the Revolution.
Let's explore one of those battles. One aspect that I really loved about Independence Lost is how it tells the story of the American Revolution in the Gulf Coast by focusing on several people who lived through and participated in the war. Kathleen, would you tell us about the Battle of Pensacola and the roles British General John Campbell and Spanish General Bernardo de Galvez played in that battle?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so historians are really not that willing to say these days that historical events turn on individual character, individual personality. And so I really resisted this comparison that just is true between General John Campbell, who was the British general stationed at Pensacola, and Spanish General Bernardo de Galvez, who was stationed in New Orleans and was pushing east into West Florida. But the fact is they just were tremendously different men, and the differences between them ended up being quite important. Bernardo de Galvez became the governor of Louisiana in 1777, and when he was posted there, many, many Spaniards would have thought this was the end of the world. It's the far edge of the Spanish Empire. It's not where you want to get sent as an ambitious young man. But Bernardo de Galvez is extremely excited about it. He sends these optimistic letters back to his superiors saying, there's so much possibility here. Just send me some more resources. We could invade West Florida. We could, this is really the future of the Spanish Empire up here. General John Campbell, the British general, when he's posted to Pensacola, does basically the opposite thing. He writes over and over to General Henry Clinton and to George Germain saying, you've sent me to this wilderness. This is a terrible place. There's no hope here. And unsurprisingly, their letters back to him were just, grow up, John Campbell, quit complaining. And so the British were really spread out over many fronts by this point in the war, and they end up not sending him any more reinforcements. And it's possible they might not have sent him anymore anyway, but his sort of downer letters, I think, are part of their decision. And Galvez's, definitely his enthusiastic letters, all about possibility. They convinced the king to order Havana to send him huge numbers of reinforcements. And then also locally, Galvez inspired his own colonists, most of whom were French. Remember, he comes in as a Spaniard trying to rule French people. He inspires them to volunteer for the militia and convinces them that they should be patriotic subjects of the Spanish Empire. He recruits 600 militiamen for his attacks on the British Mississippi coast, nearly half his force at that point in the war is militia. And then he attracts more forces from Havana after that because of those victories. Campbell does the opposite. He complains that he can't recruit West Florida subjects into the militia. For one expedition, he gets 7 men to volunteer, but he's not out there making speeches and encouraging people the way Galvez does. He writes these letters to Clinton saying, "It's not fair. Galvez is such a dictator. He has them under martial law, so they're forced into the militia." But you look at the Spanish sources, and it's just not true. Galvez has to get out there and recruit them. He doesn't have any more power to make them fight than Campbell does. And the results is really important. Galvez is able to win these battles because he has men, some of them local, and some of them from the empire at large. And he even when Galvez moves into West Florida, so coming across French settlers and British settlers here, he also convinces many of them that the Spanish Empire can provide them the protection and the markets that they want out of empire, that they want for their lives, for their families.
John Campbell doesn't sound excited at all.
No.
I mean, if I had to fight for someone, you'd want to go with someone who thinks you could win.
Exactly. Right. But I think, at this point, Henry Clinton is ordered to send somebody to West Florida, and he actually decides not to send one of his best officers because he has higher priorities.
In her book, Kathleen mentions that the loss of Pensacola and West Florida helped push the British to cut their losses after the Franco-American force cornered General Charles Cornwallis at the Battle of Yorktown in October 1781. Kathleen, would you elaborate on this point for us and tell us how and why the Battle of Pensacola played such an important role in British imperial decision-making?
Well, I think one of the really important things to remember is that Britain is looking at the globe. It is making decisions about this war as a global war, not as a local war just based in the sort of Atlantic seaboard colonies. And when they lose West Florida, they have lost a colony that wasn't in rebellion, and also a colony that they had pretty high hopes for, at least some in the British administration had high hopes for as a new plantation colony, a profitable colony. And that figures pretty seriously in their mathematics of the war. And then second, sort of more practically, the Spanish Navy, as soon as they win the Battle of Pensacola, the Spanish Navy sails to the West Indies and relieves de Grasse, the French admiral, making him free to sail to Yorktown, and him and Cornwallis there. So in part, the Battle of Yorktown is the Americans win the Battle of Yorktown because the French fleet is able to get there, in part because of the victory at Pensacola. Galvez at the same time goes to Hispaniola. He collects 20,000 white and black troops. They take the Bahamas, and they're waiting for de Grasse to try to take Jamaica, which will be their next target, I think the most profitable colony in the British Empire at this point. And so when the British are doing this kind of calculation about what this war is worth, I mean, there are many things going on in what they're thinking about, but one of them is that they might also now lose Jamaica, and that would be a bigger loss than anything on the Atlantic seaboard, and that helps to push them toward peace.
It's always interesting because we like to think as Americans that we were the jewel of the British Empire, and yet we really weren't. The 13 colonies just weren't, and it's always tough to hear.
That's right.
What did Spanish victory in the Gulf Coast mean for the British and the native peoples who were living there? And I'm thinking perhaps you could tell us a story about James and Isabella Bruce to help illustrate this point.
Yeah, sure. So Spain, as I said, Spain really didn't have colonists to send there. They have a huge empire. They can't really persuade certainly Spaniards, but even Mexicans to come to West Florida. They had to try to recruit locals. And as they spread east into West Florida, that was even more true. as their empire is really growing. So they make Indian alliances, they promise trade and goods and protection of land of American Indians. But they also need to recruit these French and British colonists in West Florida to convince them the Spanish Empire can give them the benefits that they want. But they didn't make these offers to British loyalists who were very clear loyalists, people who couldn't claim to have been, really not all that loyal to the British Empire to begin with. So that's where the story of James and Isabella Bruce comes in. And I think for me, they really represent this concept of independence lost, of people whose dreams of an independent life for themselves, for their children, get destroyed by the American Revolution. So let me just tell you a little bit about them. James Bruce was a veteran of the French and Indian War. He served in Canada. Isabella Bruce they were both from Scotland, from Aberdeen. And they married and went to West Florida to try to make their fortune there. They became landowners, partly because of his service in the French and Indian War. They got a land grant and they built on that. They established plantations. They bought slaves. They sold indigo to the markets of the British Empire. And at the same time, because there weren't all that many British people there, James Bruce was able to make himself useful to the British governor. He got put on His Majesty's Council, so he's part of the sort of upper body of the councils ruling West Florida locally. So I use them. We see in their story the benefits of empire that can come to people who really have very little in their home country, but they start to see that their family is building a dynasty. They're wealthy. They're politically important. They have a son and a daughter whose future they see as much much more prestigious than theirs and their parents had been in Scotland. And the Bruces are right there during the Battle of Pensacola, in the fort at Pensacola, while basically the Spanish is practically shooting right over them, trying to take the fort. And at the end of the battle, the Spanish win the Battle of Pensacola. The Bruces were expelled from the colony because of his official office that he held. And they went to London to try to make a claim against the British Crown as loyalists. And many loyalists were in London at the time trying to get payback for the losses that they'd suffered because of the revolution. But there was very little money to hand out. And so Parliament made the decision that British colonists, loyalists from the Florida, couldn't get recompense because they had been in colonies that weren't in rebellion. And technically the law had said it was for loyalists within colonies in rebellion against the crown. And so here's these loyalists who were part of keeping their own colonies loyal to the crown, whose futures were just really destroyed by the American Revolution.
They must have felt betrayed. Not only did they lose their home, which when you describe when the Bruces moved to Pensacola, it's like a backwater. There's not much there. And so they work hard to forge their life. And then loyalists throughout the Atlantic seaboard, they leave and, then the British government won't recompense them.
Right. And like so many things in history, I mean, it's a huge tragedy for them. And from the one angle, we feel terrible for them of having believed in this future that then just gets destroyed. And of course, on the other hand, they're slave owners. They are building their future on the backs of other human beings. And not that their slaves get any better off in the American future that's going to come than they had with the Bruces. But I think it tells us about colonialism and also the United States to come. There are many sides to the same story.
How did the Spanish victory in the Gulf Coast affect the negotiations of the Treaty of Paris 1783, which would end the War of American Independence?
So the Spanish get to Paris for the negotiations, believing they have won the revolution. They've made huge gains. So they've won these battles along the Gulf Coast and up the Mississippi. There were a couple other little skirmishes that have given them the idea by the end of the war that they have expanded east of the Mississippi as far east as the Flint River in Georgia, which is well into what's now the state of Georgia, and then as far north as the Great Lakes. So including really all these lands west of the Appalachians that have been at issue in the French and Indian War and Pontiac's War and the American Revolution. Spain thinks they own them, so they come basically with these maps showing them having all this land. But they get there, and France is trying to sort of mediate in between, and the British really just want to put this war behind them as quickly as they can. So the British make a separate peace with the United States, the United States makes a separate peace with Britain without its French ally, but without the Spanish. And the British say to the United States in the Treaty of Paris that they have most of the land between the Appalachians and the Mississippi. But the Spanish say that the British had no right to surrender these lands. So the border between the United States and the Spanish colonies is still unsettled at the end of the Treaty of Paris. Probably as a result of these victories by the Spanish against the British. And that's one of the things that has to be sort of worked out over the first decade or two of the new republic.
One aspect of the Treaty of Paris of 1783 that fascinates me is that Great Britain had curried favor with all of these Native American peoples, not just the peoples of the Gulf Coast, but up in New York, like the Haudenosaunee peoples and others in the Midwest. And they ended up giving the United States a lot of the Native American land in the Treaty of Paris of 1783. So I wonder if you could tell us how the native peoples of the Gulf region felt and reacted when they heard that Britain had ceded their land politically to the United States.
Yeah, as you can imagine, they were shocked and disgusted and mostly just said, well, you can't do that. That's not what that piece of paper says, because it can't. The British can't give away our lands like that. And they talked about it and they met about it a lot. So there were lots of meetings in 1783 and 1784 between Indians from the north and from the south about what they were going to do about this ridiculous thing that seemed to have come out of Paris. Alexander Macgillivray, who's one of the people that I follow, who's a Creek leader, son of a Scottish merchant and a Creek woman. He is part of a council of Creeks, Chickasaws, and Cherokees, and they write a record of it, and they say, some of us fought on the British side of the war, but that didn't mean we, as he puts it, it doesn't mean we forfeited our independence and our natural rights to the King of Great Britain. We're not the subjects. We were his allies, and we didn't agree to this treaty. So it really pushes forward a pan-Indian movement, both in the North and in the South, and a movement trying to coordinate those. And it makes it more important than ever that they ally with the Spanish. And so Indians in the Southeast and Spain get together and make agreements of basically mutual protection of their land. And Spain agrees to, in the border negotiations with the United States, to represent Indians there too. And so Indians do feel that, at least for a little while, they have a voice in European-based negotiations through Spain, and the negotiations that Spain has with the United States. Eventually, those go the way of the United States. But for a while, it does seem that by banding together against the United States, Spain and southeastern Indians and northern Indians can push back on the Treaty of Paris and declare it not binding on the actual land.
I wonder if we could explore some of these alliances that are formed after the Treaty of Paris of 1783 is signed. In episode 29, Colin Calloway told us about the formation of the Miami Confederacy and how the native peoples had joined together in that confederacy to stop, or I guess at least slow, the rapid westward migration of white Americans into what is now the Midwest. In Independence Lost, Kathleen notes that many Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Alabama peoples also confederated to help slow American expansion into the Gulf Coast. Kathleen, would you tell us how these peoples came to band together and whether their confederacy was successful in stopping or at least slowing American migration into the Gulf Coast?
Yeah, so in some ways, most of these, not the Cherokees, but the others in the Southeast, they've been hearing for a long time from the Cherokees and from Indians in the Ohio Valley that Americans are really dangerous. They'll try to take your land. And most of the Indians of the Southeast are a little farther from American settlements and think that's exaggerated. But when pretty soon after the American Revolution, Americans begin to flood over the Appalachians, reestablishing some of the small posts that they had founded before the Revolution, and then growing and pushing and forming more and more settlements. The Creeks and the Choctaws and the Chickasaws get convinced pretty fast So they start to try to work on alliances to build a Southern Confederacy that'll be sort of the mirror of the Northern Confederacy based in the Ohio Valley, and to coordinate between those two confederacies and to bring Spain in, and they hope also Britain in, to fund it, to provide the military equipment to make it a success. And it's really radical for these different Indian groups to try to get together, who are really, many of them were fighting one another a decade or two earlier than that. So they spend a lot of time working on that, and some of them trying to persuade others that it's extremely important for their future. And it does work for a little while. The Creeks have a major war against Georgia and really keep Georgia hemmed in to basically Augusta and Savannah, not much farther west than that, for a decade or so. But it's hard to hold together. It sort of goes against the history of the region, of the different Indian nations, past relationships with one another. Spain also is some years extremely committed to supporting it, other years more wary of going to war against the United States, realizing that they don't actually have, they aren't technically at war with the United States and maybe shouldn't be funding these wars. And not all the Indians agree on that fighting is the best policy. The Chickasaws worked, especially under the leadership of Payamatahha, who's one of the main characters in the book. They worked during the years between the 7 Years' War and the Revolution to really change the Chickasaws from being one of the most feared and hated people in the region, feared and hated by Indians even more than by Europeans, to being peacemakers. The Chickasaws begin to forge peace with all kinds of people, native and European. And so many Chickasaws, including Payamatahha, think that the United States is somebody they should be at peace with, that they should work with, that the future of the Chickasaws is not war with anybody, that it's multiple alliances. And so the Chickasaws and the Creeks actually even occasionally get into a military skirmish over this because the Chickasaws don't agree that the Southern Confederacy should begin to control Chickasaw foreign policy. So I'm not sure there's anything they could have done. Of course, the population of the United States was doubling every generation or so. It was a population that believed that land was the foundation of their independence, of their citizenship. The Constitution, when it's written, creates this process whereby new territories can become fully part of the Union that sort of takes the rug out from under some of the Spanish efforts to attract subjects, to convince some Americans that they actually would get more out of the Spanish Empire than they'll get out of this sort of weak republic. But then I think that the sort of what finally ends it all is, and certainly ends, the attention that the Spanish are giving, the resources the Spanish are giving, is the rise of Napoleon. That he just really takes Europe's eye off of the Gulf Coast of the southeast of Indian allies, and leaves them pretty open to this huge population flood coming in from the east.
These Native American peoples are another population where independence is lost. It's not just the Loyalists who are forced to evacuate.
Yeah, maybe they're the most obvious, right?
Let's transition to the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Kathleen, in your opinion, what might have happened if the British had not lost Pensacola? How would the history of the American Revolution and the United States have been different?
Well, I think if the British hadn't lost Pensacola, particularly if they'd managed to destroy the Spanish and French fleet that was there at Pensacola in that battle, Yorktown would have been very different. They might have won at Yorktown with all the repercussions that might have had for not ending the American Revolution. On the other hand, if I think of sort of what if West Florida had remained, if the American Revolution had succeeded and there's the United States on the seaboard, on the Atlantic seaboard, but West Florida is British, I am not sure that would have made a big difference, because I really think the Spanish put as much attention and resources into this region, into trying to hold back the United States, as the British would have. So I'm not sure that part of the story would have changed that much, but it's interesting to imagine.
Would you tell us about your new project? Now that you've finished this book, you must be working on something new and exciting.
So So when I first started working on this book, I had, or in sort of the first manuscript version of this book, one of my characters was Bernardo de Galvez, the Spanish general whom I've mentioned. And my editor said that he was really taking over the book. I have so many more sources from him. He wrote to multiple people every single day and sort of trying to put him on the same planes as poor Petit Jean, the enslaved spy who didn't write at all, who I only have mentions of in several Spanish letters and a census or two. I hadn't been able to sort of corral Galvez into his role in relation to the other characters. So my editor suggested doing a biography of him separately. So I think what I'm going to do, what I'm starting to noodle with, is a joint biography of the Spanish general Bernardo de Galvez and his wife, Marie Félix de Saint-Maxent. She was the daughter of a prominent French Louisiana family, and so it really shows how the French and Spanish colonial efforts sort of came together in Louisiana. He ended up being appointed Viceroy of New Spain because of his victories in the American Revolution. And they went there together. They were hugely popular. And he was a reformer on the behalf of the poor of Mexico City. Really a visionary for not only a newly expanding Spanish empire, but for a different kind of empire, an empire that maybe could have headed off the Spanish independence movement that would happen later in the 19th century. But he dies very young, dies in Mexico City, and then she goes back to Spain, and she's admired in Spain and loved in Spain until the French Revolution, at which point she's very French, and she gets exiled, and terrible things happen to her children. So I just feel that this couple helped bring together all of these fascinating changes of the Age of Revolution that I want to explore a little bit more.
Fantastic. I look forward to reading that, especially since, de Galvez is such a positive guy. I'd love to know what his vision for the Gulf Coast and North America was.
Yeah.
For those of us who would like to get in contact with you so we can talk more about your book, or we just have other questions we didn't have a chance to answer today, where's the best place to go and look for more information about you, your work, and how we can reach you?
Yeah, so great. That would be wonderful. The easiest way to get most of it is just on my website at the University of North Carolina. So if you just go and sort of search UNC History Department and my name, you'll find me there and all my contact information and my publications. You can also go straight to the Random House website and get order information and things like that.
We'll include links to those places in the show notes page for this episode. Kathleen, thank you so much for joining us and for showing us the twists and turns of the American Revolution down in the Gulf Coast.
Thank you, Liz. I enjoy your show so much, and it's such an honor to be on it.
The colonies located along the Gulf Coast may not have rebelled against Great Britain, but the American Revolution had profound consequences for the region. As Kathleen revealed, the Battle of Pensacola helped to push the British into cutting their losses after Charles Cornwallis's surrender at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. The war also disrupted the lives of the people in the Gulf Coast. However, unlike their counterparts who lived in the 13 rebellious colonies, the Loyalists who lived in the Gulf Coast were unable to seek compensation for their lost property. They, like the Native Americans in the Gulf Coast, Northeast, South, and Midwest, lost their independence. Sometimes we get caught up in the gloriousness of the American Revolution and how it created our nation, the United States. This is certainly something we should be grateful for and celebrate. But as we celebrate, we should also remember that the Revolution was not a glorious event for all. As Kathleen has shown us, for many, the American Revolution meant the loss of independence, not the gaining of it. You can find more information about Kathleen, her excellent book, Independence Lost, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode. You'll find it all at benfranklinsworld.com/037. Would you like to receive access to Poor Richard's Club, the social community for Ben Franklin's World listeners, or receive the show notes for each episode in your inbox? If so, text BF World to 33444 to sign up for the Franklin Gazette so you can receive the show notes for next week's episode and for every episode after that in your inbox. Please help me spread the word about Ben Franklin's World. Please tell your friends, family, and fellow history lovers, or people that you suspect enjoy history, about our show. You can send them to benfranklinsworld.com for more information. Finally, would you help me get creative? I have asked you to be my Paul Revere and my Mary Catherine Goddard two historic figures that help to spread the word about important historical events, in my effort to entice you to help me to spread the word about Ben Franklin's world. Do you have ideas about other early Americans who helped to spread the word about important news and events that I could use to highlight my requests? I want to make these requests informative as well as fun. Please send your ideas to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, via tweet to @LizCovart, or if you would like to use your idea and ask your fellow listeners on my behalf, visit benfranklinsworld.com. Click the Ask the Historian button on the right-hand side and record your request, and I may play it in a future episode.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.